I apologise, there is a bit of an echo. I've got a phone on as well. So if you can hear it through the computer, I can turn off the phone. I would say that the webinar is being recorded. So anyone that's not able to make it or can't hear me overly well, I will send out the recording later on. So firstly, thank you to everybody for joining today's webinar. I apologise for the connectivity issues that you may be experiencing. These are one of the joys of working from home. I will make sure that everyone does get a copy of this recording, and anyone that wants a specific conversation with me afterwards on any of the questions that I raise, please do feel free to talk to me. So the other thing I have to make you aware of is, as I'm working from home, I do have a dog. He may decide that he wishes to participate in today's webinar. So if you hear any barking, that is Loki. It's just the fun times of working from home. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to work through the slides. We're going to talk about the types of data you may be processing under the regulation in relation to coronavirus, and then I'm going to talk to you about some of the challenges that you and your staff may face whilst they are working from home. There is an opportunity at the end of the session to ask me any questions that you may have. Feel free to jot those questions down now, and I will come back to them at the end. So hopefully we're all here to listen to what are the risks, or what are the data protection risks related to the coronavirus. So my name is Kelly Peters. I'm a co-founder of Databasix. I've been working in governance and data protection in public and private sector for almost 20 years. And I'm a little bit passionate about data protection, and that may come across in today's webinar. So what I want to talk to you about is that obviously we are in unprecedented times in terms of what globally we are trying to deal with. And we have to be mindful that we still have responsibilities under the data protection regulation, both from a GDPR perspective as well as the UK data protection legislation. We may be asked or be asking to collect new types of information that we've previously never collected, some of which may be classed as special category of data. And this is, for example, the likes of health data. Now, you will have travel information, you may be asking location data, you may also be asking for names and contact details, which you may have previously had personal details, but you may not have asked for location or travel information. And I'm going to explain to you why it's important that we have a purpose for processing this information. So firstly, I want to talk to you about the rule book that I feel that we should all be following when it comes to the regulation, and hopefully the slide will open. So these are the core principles of the regulation that I want to focus on for coronavirus. So you have to be clear from the outset the types of data that you are going to be processing and why you are going to be processing that information. So we do need to be fair. I do apologise that the slides do seem to be taking a little bit long to load. Hopefully it will load up in a minute. So here we are talking about you being fair, honest and transparent. So this is an example of if you are asking visitors to, when they're coming to your office, or you have been, because most of you may now be working from home, you may have been asking them to, or your staff, for example, have they travelled to any of the at-risk locations in the last 14 days? And you may be asking them to give you that information. Now, you have a legal obligation as an employer to make sure that you can collect and process that information. So you're protecting the welfare and the health of your staff. So the regulation absolutely allows you to collect that. It's just about being clear that for the protection of your staff, you need to be made aware of travel from affected areas. And in some instances, you may, for where we work on our campus, people may not be allowed onto the campus if they have travelled to one of the at-risk areas and have been told to isolate. You must only process the information that's relevant to make those types of decisions. So you don't need to know every piece of health-related information, but what you do need to know is the core information that allows you as an employer to make those decisions about whether or not staff should all now be working from home, or whether or not actually you don't have the facilities to work from home. You are closing the office down and then having to make decisions around that. For the coronavirus, in terms of visitor logs, where you're asking for location information, or where you are asking whether a staff member has been in contact with someone that's had coronavirus or they are self-isolating, you only need to collect and store that information for a minimum amount of time. So where it says only keep information for as long as necessary, we do need to be mindful of that. Whereas typically employment records we are keeping for, the lifetime that an employee is with us, plus 6 or 7 years after they've left. For this purpose, you don't need that information for that length of time. You'll definitely need it for the duration that we are being advised by the government to manage this situation. But then you'll need to make sure that you have a retention policy that allows you to say, I no longer need this information about visitors or for your staff. And obviously, we still need to be mindful of individual rights. Individuals still have the right to know what information you're processing on them. So where you are asking for new information, such as where are you going to be based in terms of your location, where have you visited, have you been diagnosed with coronavirus, or have you, do you believe you have it? You need to be mindful that you can store that, but they may also want access to it just in case they feel that more information than is necessary is being stored on them. So I've drawn some questions from the Information Commissioner's website because it is super useful. I find it super useful. So here are some questions that are quite useful. So you absolutely can collect information, health data on your employees or from visitors to your organisation. In fact, you have an obligation to make sure that your staff are protected. It's important that, like I said already, that you only collect the information for the purpose of managing the coronavirus within your workplace. And I've got an example here that for the visitors, you may only want to store that information for up to 30 days after their visit, and then you can securely destroy that. So your purpose here is that you're asking visitors to complete a simple travel survey, asking them where they've been in the last 14 days. You're then going to determine a decision as to whether or not they should come in to meet with you. And again, you're making a decision about how long you retain that information. All is in line with the regulation. Now, you may be asked questions about, can you share information with employees about coronavirus? So you can absolutely tell members of staff that another individual has been in contact with someone that has been diagnosed with coronavirus, or they are self-isolating. You don't necessarily need to let the individual know the name of the person, because it's not really necessary. You just need to be maintaining yes, we do have some people that have been affected. This is how we're processing the information. This is how we're managing the situation. But you don't need to name individuals, because you do have to make sure that everyone, again, as I've mentioned a couple of times, are safe and secure, as is your duty of care as an employer. Now, there have been a number of questions about whether or not you will need to be notifying external bodies about coronavirus. Certainly, events hosts are asking you to provide information if the event hasn't yet been cancelled, about whether your staff have been in contact with that. But you are very unlikely to have to notify a public authority. Only medical professionals have to report the notifiable disease. It's part of their responsibility. It's unlikely that you will be asked by the government or by a local authority to provide that information. However, you may, for example, where the offices that I'm based at, we do need to make our landlord aware that we do have, well, we don't, but if we were to have any cases of coronavirus, that this is the situation, and that they then need to tell the other tenants to make them aware. So you don't need to report the disease to the local authorities. If they were, they should contact you directly, but it's incredibly unlikely that that will be the case. So the core message on here is you can absolutely process personal data that relates to coronavirus, but it will be a limited amount of time, and it will be a very, very specific purpose. Now, the more challenging aspect, obviously, the part of the regulation is that we need to make sure that we are able to work in a secure environment, both physically and technologically. So we have certain responsibilities that we need to put in place. Now, you may have more of your workforce than ever before accessing work materials remotely. Therefore, there is a potential increased risk of inadvertent disclosure, or not making sure devices are as secure as what they can be, or potentially devices being lost. So I'm going to talk you through some of the practical things to be thinking about whilst we are working remotely. And I read something earlier today, which I found quite nice, actually. This is about keeping people connected. So this is not to stop you from working. This is making sure that everyone remains connected and that they can continue to deliver their work, but they are abiding by the rules and regulations that are set out in the data protection legislation. So the first thing I want to talk about is personal and work devices. And again, the slide will pop up in a moment. But this is about making sure that not everybody within your organisation will have a work device, because you may have made a decision that actually you support bring your own device to work. So you may wish to, in those situations, to remind people of the rules that you have set down in any bring your own device policy, or the section within your data protection policy or employee handbook that talks about the use of personal devices. You've got more control over a work device than you do of a personal device, but it is about being mindful that people will be accessing work materials on either of those devices. So please, yourself and your teams, take extra care with the devices, your phones, your laptops. When I talk about USBs, I'm talking about here if you've got any USB sticks that have got personal sensitive information and that you misplace or lose that. Hopefully you have encrypted all of your devices that you're in control of. So if they were to be lost or stolen, you can remotely wipe them and they're inaccessible by the individual that now has hold of them that doesn't belong to your organisation. It's important from a data protection perspective that anyone that loses a work device notifies whoever is the data protection lead for your organisation. So it could be useful to communicate with your teams to remind them, like I said, of your data protection policy and who to contact should things go awry. Make sure that your devices have the most up-to-date operating system and security patches on them, as including antivirus, and that is for your laptops, for your computers, for your mobile phones, even if they are home computers where your staff are accessing your technology. You want to make sure that they are using technology that is adequately protected. Ask your staff and yourself to make sure that any unattended devices, because when we're at home, we're more likely to get distracted. There'll be people possibly knocking at the door. You'll be getting up and around. So if you live in a house where there are several people, whilst you will share that house, they don't have the permission to see the data that you're working on. So try and lock your screen, and at the end of the day, put your laptop in a secure location so you reduce the risk of damage or accidental access to the data. Remember strong passwords. If you're accessing computers, make sure you don't put a password on a post-it note. Just if you haven't worked from home previously, you may not remember certain passwords. Try and enforce stronger passwords and make sure that you've not written them down on a post-it note and attached them to your laptop. The other thing, which sounds really silly, but I want people to be mindful of, because there's been a lot in the press about Internet of Things and smart speakers, is that if you're going to be having confidential conversations, consider turning those smart devices off. We know that they do listen. There's not concrete evidence that they are recording everything that is going on, but there has certainly been speculation that that is the case. So I would suggest that if you have Alexa, Google Home, or anything that has a listening component to it, or Siri, for example, that you turn those off whilst you're having work conversations. The next thing I want to move on to is emails. Emails are by far the highest risk of a data breach that we have today. Most disclosures happen because of emails, because we're in a rush and we accidentally send information that we shouldn't, and then that gets us into a little bit of hot water. So what we want to be thinking about here, and again, I apologise for the slowness it's taken for the slide to load up, is that you really want to encourage people to use their work emails for work purposes. Hopefully it shouldn't be too much of a stretch to be able to issue, if there's any charities listening and you've got volunteers or trustees, consider giving them access to a charity email address rather than relying on personal emails. There have been an increased risk of phishing scams that are relating to coronavirus, some purporting to provide health information, some providing to give you IT advice and guidance. Some even have been or look like they've come from the World Health Organization. So just be really mindful that whilst we are dealing with the pandemic, there are still threats to us via our email system. So please be mindful. And in a minute, I'm going to give you some examples of what to do when, or tips against phishing scams. Remind your staff, whether it be on an email or a conference call, about your policies about the use of email. It's always handy to say, you know, don't CC people, put people in blind copy if you're going to be sending out an email to a significant number of people. Check the email before you send it. Simple things that are not trying to overwhelm your teams at home, but just to reduce the risk of it happening. And if it does happen again, just ask your staff to let you know that it's happened, or whoever is your GDPR lead. Because what you don't want is finding out there has been an incident and it is a customer or a client that is coming back to you and advising you of the situation. So when we are dealing with the phishing scams, I'm sure that most of you are quite familiar with phishing scams. They come in a variety of look and feel. Some of them come in the form of asking for payment from invoices. Some are typically spoofing someone else's email address in your organisation. So some of the top things, and this has been given from the National Cybersecurity Centre. So most emails are poor grammar, poor punctuation, or poor spelling. The overall quality is not what you'd expect, especially if it looks like it's come from a senior member of team. You might be like, oh, that doesn't look like it's something they would send to me. Check who it's addressed to. So is it addressed to you by name, or does it say customer, friend, or colleague? It could be a sign that the sender doesn't know who you are. Are there any kind of veiled threats? And sometimes you'll see something that says, we have taken a video clip of you, and if you don't pay X amount of money, this video clip is going to be released to you. Well, if you know that you've turned off the functionality to record video on your laptop, or you don't even have that functionality, then it's very clear that it is a phishing scam. And just a few more tips around those, because I am expecting there to be a few more sophisticated scams out there that it could be quite easy for us to fall for. And those are the ones that come from, so you've got an email that says the bank account details have changed. Can you now pay the bill here? So where your finance teams are, or your office managers, or whoever's processing the invoices, I would always recommend that if someone gives you an email that says their details have changed, phone them on a number that you trust, not on the number that's enclosed within that specific message, and ask if that is actually the case, because 9 times out of 10 that won't be true. So that's your kind of some of the things to think about from a phishing email perspective. But then there is the element of how you're going to access work, documentation remotely. Now, depending on what infrastructure you have set up, some of you may have networks where you are providing your staff with a direct access to that, to your own servers. This might be through a virtual private network. It may be through some other means of secure connectivity. Make sure that the individuals that have previously not worked from home are clear about how they access that. We do have a responsibility to educate staff about how to access this. It shouldn't be something that you assume that they know how to do. If you are relying on your staff to use their own Wi-Fi at home, just ask them to check to make sure that it's secure and they're not broadcasting their home address. The people are like, oh, I'll check out this Wi-Fi, because people do sit outside people's homes, unfortunately. But think about granting, what access do you need to grant? So if you're using something like Microsoft Office 365 and you're using Teams, do all the people that need access to the folders have access remotely? If you're using Google or any other of the cloud-based solutions that are out there, do the people that need access to that system have access, and do they have the right level of permissions? If you are not providing people with access to information to connect to remotely, and they are storing stuff locally on their device, please make sure that they have a method to back that information up, whether it be an external hard drive, or they have got a method to back the information up, because what you don't want is key information to be lost because their computer crashes. And whilst I have very much talked about a lot of electronic stuff, we also need to be mindful that there are still a lot of us that do have paper records. If you left the office yesterday after the government advice about social distancing and now working from home, you may have taken from your office paperwork that relates to HR files. It may relate to finance files, for example. So where you are taking those files out of your office into your home, please make sure that you are keeping those papers secure. So very much like your computers, paper should be stowed away at the end of the day, whether they be in your work bag or whether they be in a secure cupboard, so that your family members and anyone that's visiting you, if that happens at the moment, do not see information that they're not entitled to see. And think about, if you've got a printer at home, do you really need to be printing off work stuff on the printer? Because if you can work entirely electronically, then you've removed that paper risk. So some of the things then in terms of your toolbox that you can consider using, so that you make sure that you and your teams and those that you are engaging, whether they be potentially associates as well, you are able to manage their expectations as well as your obligations under the regulation. And you'll be happy to know this is a relatively short checklist, but some points that I think are useful. So at the very beginning of this webinar, I mentioned that you will be collecting new types of personal information, and I used an example of a travel survey where you're asking people for their contact details, you're asking where they previously travelled in the last 14 days. You would be, or you should be, storing this information in your record of processing activities. Or it can be, it's typically an Excel spreadsheet. And this is allowing you to say, actually, we're collecting a new type of data for a limited amount of time. The basis is you have a legal obligation to protect the health and safety of your staff. And you're being clear about who has access to that information, who is sharing that data, and how long you're going to store the information. So if you're not sure of what that looks like, I can send you some links to what the Information Commissioner gives insight if you haven't done a mapping exercise. In order for you to demonstrate your transparency, which was, if you go back to, if you remember the very third or fourth slide I showed you, I talked about the rule book. The very first point was about being fair and transparent. To be able to demonstrate your transparency, you should be issuing very simple privacy notices. So if you're doing a travel survey, just explain to people what you're collecting, why you're collecting it, and how you're going to use it. That's all that privacy notice needs to be for that purpose, but make sure people know about it. If you have decided that you're going to roll out new technology to be able to facilitate home working or allowing staff to keep connected, you may need to consider doing a privacy impact assessment if you're going to be processing large or you're going to be processing personal data, for example. It's just a risk assessment that allows you to make sure that you have taken into consideration the data protection elements. But most importantly, I think I've talked about quite a lot and quite quickly in this webinar, but for you to be able to demonstrate your accountability, and that is now a principle of the regulation, I would urge you to make sure that you communicate with your teams, keep connected, and remind them that you still have obligations under the law to make sure that data is protected. Provide them with simple advice and guidance about how to work from home securely, and to suggest that if something does go wrong, to let you know. The Information Commissioner has said that she is very mindful that whilst we have more people working remotely, that if you've put all reasonable measures in place to protect information, she will take that into consideration if there was to be a breach of data protection that needed to be notified to her. So there will be consideration by the UK authority if there was to be a breach, but make sure your staff know in the first instant. And the regulation in no shape or form prevents you from working remotely. So we do now have time for questions. If you do have any, please do use the box to ask questions. So any question that you have in what I've just said, or any concern that you particularly have, feel free to type them in the chat box. Whilst those questions are coming in, I'll briefly talk about our services, and I'll come back to the questions to make sure they are answered. So if you do have any data protection questions or require any support, we do provide training, gaps, audits, gap analysis. We do help write policies. We do provide remote support, and we will be working remotely for the foreseeable future. If you do need help with mapping data, again, we have that. We have a whole raft of webinars that are on our website that have been recorded. And in fact, we've got one on Friday about how to manage staff that are leaving the business, if you are interested in that. I've not had any questions so far. What I would say to everybody is that if you'd like a copy of the webinar, I'll make sure that the recording of it is sent out to you electronically. It will also be available on our website. If any of you do feel that you're not comfortable necessarily using the chat box and you'd like to have a conversation with me and anyone that listens to this afterwards, feel free to contact us, which is the next slide, which hopefully will load up. You can email us, or you can phone us. We will certainly here to help you with any of your data protection questions. I profusely apologise for the fact that there are technical issues with this. I think a lot of people have moved to online delivery. I have a question, so I'm going to answer that. So in terms of sharing information, so if a member of staff comes up to you and they ask you if anyone has been self-isolating or they have the coronavirus, you can certainly tell an individual that there has been a member of staff that has self-isolated or they have the coronavirus. You don't necessarily need to know their name, unless, of course, you're a relatively small team and it doesn't take much to work out who that person is. You'll also have a responsibility to make sure that if that person that has been diagnosed with coronavirus has in fact been in contact with any of the members of your team, because you may need to have sent them home so that they are now isolated and making sure their family members are isolated. So you can absolutely share information. You just don't necessarily need to tell staff about the name, and you're sharing that information because you're trying to protect the welfare of your workforce. I hope you was able to hear that okay, and that made sense. I'm mindful that I've taken up half an hour of your lunchtime. If there are no questions, I'd like to thank you all very much for joining me on today's webinar and all the challenges that we had. I'm very happy that my dog decided not to join the conversation. I hope that you all have a very safe and secure rest of today, and please feel free to contact us with any data protection questions. If you'd like to be kept informed of future webinars, you will always be given the option to opt out of future webinar notifications. So you don't have to hear from us again if you don't wish to. Thank you. I appreciate the support. That's it. Please enjoy the rest of your day. I will now bring the webinar to a close. I agree. There was a statement that's just been made. It's really hard to manage the current situation as there are not many test cases about how to do this, but we'll learn. And if I find out anything more and I think it's informative, I'll certainly let everybody know. So thank you, everybody.